Right, good evening students, and welcome to the lesson on the consequences of a declining population. If you had just spent 2 minutes watching the overview, you realize that the population policy of Singapore, we are focusing on three aspects: the causes, the consequences, and the solutions to a declining population. So in other words, you would have watched already what is causing or what caused our population decline, the rationale behind population control, and the second part here today or this evening is really to examine what are the consequences. So you should be referring to the notes on the consequences of a declining population, which have already been given out to you this week, and if you need to refer to it on this website, it's in the posting, which is just before this video. So let's start. Now, essentially, when we are talking about a consequence of a declining population, there are several consequences. I mean, just off the cuff, you can pause the video at this point and ask yourself, if Singapore's population were to fall, what exactly would be some of the consequences? So just take a minute or so, maybe write down on a foolscap paper what could be some of the consequences. That is the impact. When we talk about consequences, and let me put this down on the whiteboard here, we're talking about the impact. Right, the impact. That is what happens when a population declines. Is there something negative that happens? Is there something negative that happens? So take a minute, write it down on a piece of paper, and we'll have a discussion shortly after this. Well, 2 minutes is up, and what could be some of the negative consequences of a declining population? Well, first of all, if population were to continually decline, then what happens is that we're going to have an aging population. An aging population meaning to say that the number of old people outnumber the number of young people. So one of the key consequences of an aging population would be an aging population where the number of old people is much greater than the number of young people. So then the question is, so what? Because ultimately, if you look at the first part of the notes, we were considering the overarching question. So let's just pause a little bit. We know that one of the reasons or one of the consequences, serious consequences of an aging population, of a declining population, is an aging population. That is, there are far more old people than there are young people. But what is the overarching question which we want to examine? Let's say for a type 1 question. And a type 1 question is a straightforward question. They're going to ask you perhaps to explain how an aging population is a serious consequence of a declining population. So there you have it, right? Explain how an aging population is a serious consequence of a declining population. And really, what is the given factor? The given factor is, as you have learned through type 1 essay writing, aging population. So aging population is the given factor. What is the issue to be explained? What is the issue to be explained? Pause the video for a minute and ask yourself, alright, which part of this question is the issue to be explained? You can pause right now. Well, if you have guessed it right, it would be it would be how, right? The issue to be explained is how this particular given factor leads to a serious consequence of a declining population. In other words, the issue to be explained is the serious nature of the consequence, which in this case is the given factor, the aging population. Because the population is aging, what is the serious outcome because of that? And this serious outcome comes about because of the population declining. So in other words, because the population is declining, you have more old than young, right? Because your population is going down, you have more old than young, and as a result of that, what is the serious outcome? What is the serious outcome? Right? What is the serious outcome of that? Okay, so that's what you need to explain. That's the issue to be explained. How is it possible that when there are more old people than there are young people, that there is going to be something negative that's going to happen to Singapore? So let's talk about that first given factor, so that we understand now that in this particular question here, given factor is an aging population. So how does that become a serious impact of the declining population? In other words, how does that seriously affect Singapore? So if we go back to the premise that an aging population is one where there are more old people and young people, again, take 30 seconds, a minute, think about it. If the number of old people were far more than young people, how do we classify an old person? Probably somebody who has retired, someone who is advanced in age, 60 and above, 62, 65. Retirement age would probably be pushing 65. And so if you have a large proportion of such people, what could be some of the negative outcomes on a nation? Alright? So you may have already thought of this, and one of the negative outcomes would be there could be increase in medical cost. I mean, at an individual level, there is already an increase in the outcome of the medical costs at an individual level here. Okay, increase in medical costs. Now, why is there an increase in medical costs? Well, I think first of all, at an individual level, if people get old, they tend to fall ill more often. They probably need more medication, increased visits to the doctor, usual wear and tear for human body. But you multiply this increased medical costs by total number of old people in Singapore, right? If you were just to think for a moment, right, if you were to kind of take the total number of old people in Singapore, the individual medical costs, and you multiply that by the total number of old people in Singapore, you realize that that's quite possibly a very large number. And not all of this is paid for from the pocket of the person. It could be from the state, because the subsidies, right, in healthcare, which you will learn in the next chapter. And because of this, there would have to be an increase in the distribution of tax from other public users to healthcare. I say again, there's going to be a need to redistribute money from the government, from total tax amount collected from other users to healthcare, which means that other ministries, like Ministry of Education, Ministry of National Development, right, all these other ministries would have less money, and more money would be poured into healthcare. But because the amount of tax to be collected at any one point would probably be finite, then what happens is that there's going to be less money. If you pour more money into healthcare, there'll be less money for other national needs. So this could prove to be a problem. For example, you probably have less money for defense, less money for education, right? And this could affect the nation in other ways. So this could be one of the serious consequences right? So one of the serious consequences, and we can hear that coming through, would be the impact on how much money is available for healthcare. And that may not be a great deal, right? Because there's a limit to the amount of money needed, and if you were to put some more money there, then there'll be less money for other national needs. Okay, so there would be less money available for other national needs. So this could prove to be a problem. Okay, as you can see, there's less money available for other national needs. Now, this could prove to be a problem. For example, you could end up with a weaker defense force, less schools being built, right? And these all could have negative outcomes on the country. But at a more individual level, you'll find that there'll be fewer young people supporting more old people. So that's another concept, right? So an aging population, while you have increased medical costs as one of the big concerns or impacts which you would have, the other aspect is that you would have fewer taxpayers who are the young supporting the old. So you have fewer taxpayers, right? You have fewer taxpayers who are the young supporting the old, right? A large number of old people. And so in other words, you may not have enough resources to care for the elderly. So, well, you may note that what I say about Mr. Lim doesn't sound as though the explanation is exactly what the notes are saying, but by and large, right? Because we're not rote learning here, we're basically thinking about the concepts, and we are trying to use our own words to explain it, right? Because at the end of the day, the issue to be explained is basically how an aging population, as the given factor, creates problems, negative outcomes for a country. And this aging population comes about because the population is declining and the number of old people supersedes or exceeds the number of young in a country. So to summarize, all right, what we have discussed so far, two consequences of an aging population, which comes about because of a declining population. So the given factor is here. One of the consequences of a declining birth rate or declining population is an aging population, where the number of young are far less than the number of old. And because of that, the medical cost is actually rising. And because medical costs are actually rising, how do we think about it that way? Because individually people do get unwell more often because they're older. And if you multiply that by the total number of elderly in the country, the tax burden on the country is quite considerable. So impact on how much money is available for healthcare. So more money is required for healthcare, less is available for other national needs. You can give the example of less money for schools, defense, and therefore defense weaker. Singapore is more vulnerable for a foreign attack. And because of that, there is negative impact on Singapore. Now, of course, then we also know that an aging population, right, can lead to fewer taxpayers, right? If you can see that, I'll push a bit closer for you. Fewer taxpayers because fewer young people supporting the old. So may not have enough resources to care for the elderly. And this is true at both the national level as well as at the individual level. So individual family, if you have only one young person, because they gave birth to only one child, looking after two elderly people, the financial burden therefore on that one income earner is considerable, and so that would prove if you multiply that by the number of families in Singapore, you would realize that the total number of young people who are being financially strained, and that's in your notes if you look carefully, financially strained to support number of old people at the family level, and then you multiply that by X number of families at the national level, grows exponentially. I mean, it's considerable amount of financial strain. So we're quite clear now, therefore, that an aging population, where we define that to be more old than there are young people nationally, we understand that there's an impact both the individual family level and the national level, and we're talking about essentially increased medical costs at the individual and the national level, and we're talking about the fact that fewer younger taxpayers are available to support a large group of elderly who are retired and therefore not economically productive anymore. And therefore there could be a strain on the resources at the individual, family, and at the national level, and that would prove to have a serious negative impact, since tax collected is essentially finite. That is, there's a limit to which how much tax can be increased and therefore collected. Right? We cannot increase income tax or whatever other tax, indirect taxes we have indefinitely. So there we have it. Essentially, we have explained what is one of the very serious consequences of aging population. So we have two more consequences to look into, and we're going to talk about that shortly. By the moment, you can pause, and we'll see you in a bit.